Thanks for being with us on AM Agenda. Joining me now, the Parliamentary Secretary for Health, Mark Butler, and the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Disability, Senator Mitch Fifield. Gentlemen, good morning to you both.
Good morning, Kieran.
Mark, your response to this poll. We spoke to Julie Bishop. She was scathing of what this represents. What do you put it down to? 14 points the Prime Minister's fallen in just 3 weeks.
Well, look, the government's had to make a couple of pretty tough decisions, which we've thought are in the national interest, and I think there's probably no surprise to commentators or to the parties that there's been a bit of a reflection of that in the polls, but we're convinced that those were the right decisions to take in the national interest. We need to build on the budget now and continue with our agenda for health reform and a range of other things into the next election. But look, I mean, commentating on polls is really your job, not mine. We're not entirely surprised by this, but we've got a job of work to do over the next several weeks.
Not all the numbers are transferring over to the coalition. It was something I mentioned to Julie Bishop. What do you put that down to? Are people not convinced about Tony Abbott yet? They want to see a bit more of the detail.
Well, these polls always do a notional allocation of preferences, so we've got to assume that that'll be a fairly accurate preference flow. But what the poll really shows is that the public pay on results. You can't be a Prime Minister who consistently breaks promises, who abandons commitment to childcare centres, who abandons commitment to ETS. You can't be a Prime Minister who shows that he can't administer anything properly, whether it be home insulation schemes, green loan schemes, or the building of school halls. You ultimately pay a price for breaking your word, and you pay a price for manifesting competence. I mean, Kevin Rudd did a pretty good job at crafting himself as a bit of a policy wonk and a policy nerd, but I think what the public are realising is he's not a policy wonk, he's just a wonk.
Okay, can I ask you, Mark, about the couple of the points that Mitch makes, particularly on the ETS? Was that backflip just too... I mean, they've pushed it back. The government still says it supports an ETS, but after all the strong language, leading into the Copenhagen summit last year, the last campaign, it was just, you know, the great moral challenge of our time, and then just to drop it, does this reflect badly on the leader? And people are saying, well, what does Kevin Rudd actually believe in?
Well, let's be clear why there's no ETS in place. There's no ETS in place because the Liberal Party welched on a deal that was negotiated in good faith, because the Liberal Party allowed itself to be captured by radical climate change deniers, and finally in the last moment, because the Greens failed to support the introduction of an ETS as well at the last minute. So, you know, the Prime Minister, ministers like Penny Wong, worked incredibly hard both here and on the global scene to get an ETS in place in Australia, and were blocked by Tony Abbott and the radical right. So,
But aren't people disappointed now that they backed you for action on climate change, and now we've seen this fall of 14 points? That's a huge drop, I should say, in less than a month.
Yeah, look, I think I'm incredibly disappointed there's no ETS in place either. But let's be very clear where the blame sits for that, and that is with the radical right and Tony Abbott, who decided to block the ETS after negotiations in good faith had come up with what I think was a very good agreement.
Well, Kieran, this is bizarre. The government is so committed to getting an emissions trading scheme introduced that what's their policy? Their policy is to defer it, and their policy now is to run scared from a double dissolution election with an ETS. If this government really wanted an ETS, if they're really committed to this action, then they would take the ETS legislation to the polls at a double dissolution election. But they won't. They won't because they know the public don't want it, they know it's political bad news, they know it's not going to be effective, and they're running away from it at a million miles an hour.
Maybe that's wrong, because you look at the poll today and 60% of people want an ETS. But anyway, let's look at the mining tax. Again, this is a big ticket item, a centre of political debate at the moment, and most people don't want it. 47% are against it, 44% support it.
Well, this is very new, and we've got some work to do, I think, to explain to the Australian community what this tax is about and why this tax is the right thing for Australia as it is and has operated for 25 years in the oil and gas industry. I saw a mining executive on the TV over the weekend describing himself and his friends in the mining industry as God's gift to the universe. And what we're really talking about here by way of gifts is the gift that Mother Nature gave to us by way of our wealth in resources. Now, those are resources owned by every Australian man, woman and child, not by those mining executives. What we have now is a series of multi-billion-dollar multinational companies digging up those resources, making huge profits, which are often paid to investors living it up in New York and London and Beijing and Tokyo. And all we're saying is there should be a fair return on that that investment to Australian taxpayers. 10 years ago, we were getting $1 in $3 of those profits returned to taxpayers for the exploitation of these non-renewable resources. Now it's $1 in $7.
But you've obviously got to sell that message, because the poll shows that initially people aren't convinced by it. I mean, on the surface it looks like a fairly, it would be a popular sort of measure, but no.
Look, there is more work for us to do in selling this in the context also of the budget. This is a tax that is going to allow us to drive more infrastructure investment, particularly in the resource states which need it most. It's going to allow us to cut the company tax rate. It's going to allow us to build retirement incomes for working Australians. So, look, this is a package that I'm convinced is the right package, but this and the budget and the health reform package are going to have to be talked through by the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Deputy Prime Minister and others over the coming weeks. I think we recognise this. But look, it's very new. Instinctively, I think Australians are like other people around the world. They react against a tax, but I'm convinced that once we explain the reasons for this and the way in which the tax is going to be used to invest in Australia's future, support will build for it.
It's going to be a crucial week, though, isn't it, politically? I mean, there's that debate that's ongoing, but for your leader, as well as the budget tomorrow from Mr Swan, Tony Abbott's budget reply, he's doing okay in the polls now, but there hasn't been a lot of detail forthcoming.
Sure, well, the budget reply is important, but let's not forget that a budget reply merely gives a bit of an indication of the direction of an opposition. It's not an alternative budget in itself. The focus this week, quite rightly, should be on the Treasurer and his budget. And the budget is largely going to be underpinned going forward by this mining tax that we've been talking about. And Labor's approach is, if you see an industry that's prospering, if you see an industry that's going well, if you see an industry that's employing people, well, let's go and kick the heck out of it. It's a very funny approach, and we see speculation in the paper today that a feature of the budget is going to be a new focus on Australia as a financial centre, a new focus on Australia as a place to invest. Well, it's a pretty funny message to send out to the rest of the world that come and invest in Australia. Any day you could have tax arrangements change which fundamentally alter the economics of projects which have already been invested in, projects which are already underway. I think that's a very bad message to send.
There's a bit of other speculation as well.